Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Dalick and me, Israel Smith. All right, Matt. Well, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Israel.
We're back after a little break. And any New Year's resolutions for you this year? Anything you're making a big change on?
Yeah, one of my resolutions is, probably the biggest one, is to work on organizing my Mokena history collection a little better.
What does your collection look like right now?
It's the best parts of it are in binders and in file cabinets and stuff like that. But I also have stuff that's just like all over the place on the computer. And it's just like, oftentimes I'll think of something and go try to find something. And it's just like, I can never find this. Like, I know I have this thing, this bit of knowledge that I need to, cite for something or refer to for something. And it's just like, I can't find this. So hopefully on the computer, I can make it as organized as the physical collection. So,
do you think your collection, how much of it is split between physical and digital?
Good question. Oh, wow. I would say if I just had to kind of estimate, I would say maybe like 70% of it is physical. Because so much of what I've researched was done in a time when things like old newspapers and like census records and stuff like that weren't digitized and available online. So a lot of what I have is just the result of going to libraries and printing things from microfilm, or
because you would print out all of those papers as you go and research them. You're printing out the articles and the things that you'd find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. So things like digitization of good stuff like this, especially newspapers, is a very, very recent thing. The things that I have available at my fingertips now, I never would have even fathomed even 5 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of stuff is just physical sheets of paper that's organized in the file cabinets, in binders and stuff like that, accordion files. But then again, there's also a lot of stuff that I have found, on various databases and stuff like that, as things are becoming more digitized nowadays. And those are just screen captures of things that I've taken and thrown them into random files on the computer, and
which can be sometimes probably harder to find than if you had a paper file somewhere.
Yeah.
I got those too. You're just files everywhere, and
yeah.
So
it's coming together, but I'm kind of hoping that maybe this year can make some better sense of it.
There you go.
Yeah,
I didn't really have. I think obviously the naturals. You want to work out or eat better and that.
Oh yeah.
But I think my goal, one of my big goals, as we sit here today, is that we grow this podcast a little bit more this year and get more people learn about Mokena and hearing about what we're doing. So if you're listening, share it right now.
Yeah, that's doable. I think that'll happen. The way popularity's been growing around town and elsewhere. So.
Yeah, and we had a great first year. Been able to increase that. So I think that's the goal, is to keep increasing and keep growing this. So we're sitting right now, staring down a potential big snowstorm.
Yeah.
First big snowstorm of the year.
Yes, indeed.
Any good memories of Mokena snowstorms in the past?
Oh, you better believe it. Anytime there was a snowstorm growing up, of course, anybody will say this that grew up and went to public school, but always wanted a snow day. And one thing I will say, getting snow days at Lincoln Way was pretty easy early on in my first year of high school, because my first year at Lincoln Way, let's see, that would have been 2000 into 2001. Lincoln Way had not been split apart yet. The Lincoln Ways at that time consisted only of Central and New Lenox and East and Frankfort, which is where I went. And as it was back then, there were kids from Mokena, Frankfort, New Lenox, and Manhattan went to East for freshman and sophomore, and then to Central for the final 2 years. But anyway, back to what I'm saying, I feel like we got a lot of snow days in that freshman year because if the kids from Manhattan couldn't make it to Frankfurt, then, okay, well, there you go, snow day. And Manhattan was nowhere near as built up 20 plus years ago as it is now.
Sure.
So they were
still barely a blinking stoplight out there, I think, at the time.
Yeah. So they weren't able to make it in a lot, so we got a lot of snow days, which, of course, you have to make them up. But in the time, the moment, it's great.
Well, now kids, they won't necessarily always realize the joy of a snow day. Yeah. 'Cause I know my son had, brought home his computer, and they have these built-in e-learning days.
Oh, that's crazy.
So where was your best snow hill?
You read my mind. I was just going to say, in my opinion, the best place for sledding, if you just keep it in Mokena, was McGovney Park on Schoolhouse Road.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of a retention basin that's back there, I guess. But there's a decent enough slope to get some moderate sledding in. Of course, it's nothing too crazy. It's nothing that's gonna scare anybody, but it's good enough for being walkable distance from home and being able to get a little air out there.
Yeah,
So
still a favorite with kids. I know we saw the other night we had the snow and drove by, and the hill was full of kids out there.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Did you ever take a sled down Midland, or I feel like that would be a good road to slide down?
Yeah, I never did that one.
Okay.
Unfortunately, no, yeah.
Well, maybe we'll try it. I'll come grab you and we'll take a sled down.
Oh, cool. Yeah, why not? Sign me up.
All right. Well, this episode, we're going to talk about an important time for Mokena, and it was our incorporation.
Yeah.
We went for a number of years being unincorporated. And
that's right. Yeah.
And not to be a spoiler, but as is kind of leads the way in Mokena, it was really the bars and being able to have their establishments that kind of brought it around.
That's exactly what happened. And it's just it's a pretty interesting one, and I guarantee you it's a story that no one really thinks about anymore as to how this incorporation came to be.
Yeah, and to realize how important that is, to a village and the things that changed. And I know we've touched on it a little bit here and there, but really, it's a really interesting story to hear what went through. And now the village, we say the official date, 1852, right, is when Mokena was founded, or
Yep. That's right. Yeah, that's when the Rock Island was built, and when the first plat of Mokena was completed, and you had things like houses and businesses starting to sprout up and stuff like that. Yeah.
So I looked up a few things just to kind of get an idea of where the kind of the world and the country is at the time. To look back at 1852 it's a long time ago.
It is, yeah.
So
absolutely.
Millard Fillmore from New York is the president at the time.
Oh, yeah.
I thought this was interesting, especially knowing Mr. Quinn is a Studebaker guy, right?
Oh, yes, he is,
in
indeed.
1852, the Studebaker Wagon Company is established.
Oh, I didn't know that.
How about that?
Okay, that's a cool connection.
They weren't making cars yet, but...
Not yet, but they're on their way.
Later in the year, Franklin Pierce is elected the 14th president of the United States. We're kind of nearing the end of the California Gold Rush, which went from 1848 to 1855.
Oh, yeah.
This is interesting. Napoleon III becomes Emperor of France.
Yeah, sure.
And Wells Fargo Bank is founded.
Yeah.
So some interesting kind of points, I thought, and gives us an idea of where the world's at the time. And let's hear the story. The birth of a village, Mokena's Road to Incorporation, which was just posted on Matt's blog on June 4th of last year, 2023. Yeah.
A student graduates from high school, a couple gets married, and a longtime worker goes into retirement. On the road of life, milestones are reached, and when we hit them, we make them official. It's just the same with our fair village. Mokena was born in 1852 with the momentous arrival of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. And after the steel rails were laid across the prairie, by and by commerce came to our little hamlet. She came to flourish, and after 20 years of moving forward, she was ready for the next step, becoming incorporated and having the right to call herself a village. It would be a process that took the better part of half a decade, complete with stumbling blocks thrown in the way. By the time all was said and done, the resilience and can-do spirit of our forefathers had blazed a trail to prosperity. Fortune was favoring Mokena, a little town made up of young people born in or near the community, their parents who were born anywhere from Ohio to Kentucky to New York, a smattering of Canadians and Englanders, and the rest, a significantly high percentage of Germans. Respected for their agricultural acumen and straightforward hard work ethic, this was a folk who were also known to be especially thirsty. By the mid-1870s, Mokena was home to 5 general stores, 3 hotels, and 2 blacksmith shops, but also 8 lager beer saloons, more per capita than any other rural town in Will County. Proprietors such as Martin Heim, William Jacob, and brothers Ferdinand and John Sheik kept the juice of the barley flowing to the farmers and railroad workers who called Mokena home, while also netting themselves a comfortable living to boot. By this time in the narrative, Sundays in town were known to be a day where things generally got pretty out of hand. Decades later, one resident described them as being filled with street parades, picnics, and a wild time generally being celebrated on the Sabbath. The local situation was such that the attention of county bigwigs was drawn to the happenings in our burg. As it was, they were the ones issuing dram shop licenses to the barkeeps in town, these being the bureaucratic red tape that allowed the saloonists to keep their doors open. At a meeting of the Will County Board of Supervisors in early 1875, it was decided that Mokena could make do with only 3 watering holes, and thus only so many licenses were dealt out. In these days, the board was controlled by what one bystander called a temperance element, referring to the 19th century social movement that faulted the consumption of ardent spirits for all of society's woes. 5 local business owners were about to be thrown out of what was referred to as a lucrative business. The Joliet Republican noted that Mokeenians were excited to an unwanted degree and wanted the county off their backs and the ability to rule themselves. So it was that a petition made the rounds in town to incorporate the community as a village, allowing it to make its own rules, which was filed at the office of the county clerk on March 14th, 1875. Alas, not everyone in Mokena was on the same page. 70 male residents affixed their names to a rebuttal petition, to which a county judge threw up his hands. The law gave him no legal right to call the shot and come down on one side or another, and therefore the matter would have to be settled by a referendum, which was ultimately slated for April 15th at the hall of John Sutter. The balloting went off, and after an all-days sharp contest, those in favor of incorporation lost, and that with an overwhelming majority, with 25 votes being counted for and 64 against. The media of the county seat had the final word, with the Daily Sun snidely commenting that Mokena will consequently remain in her present benighted condition. Another go at trying to incorporate the town appears to have been made 3 years later in 1878, when a new petition made the rounds that ultimately garnered 34 favorable signatures. But how far this second endeavor went remains unclear after the ebb and flow of time. In any case, those with incorporation in their hearts weren't done yet. The hubbub never really died down. Previously, recalcitrant souls were won over, and once again pen was put to paper. Yet another referendum was carried out, this time on Friday, May 21st, 1880, at the scale house of John Koppel and Martin Kropp, Mokena's premier hog shippers. Male citizens turned out in droves to cast their votes, and this time the tables had turned, with 50 votes coming in favor, with 22 against. The results were certified by Judge Benjamin Olin 3 days later, he being the same Will County judge who was presented with the first petition half a decade earlier. So it was that our little railroad town of 522 souls was officially incorporated. One of the first orders of business was the election of officers, which took place June 14th, 1880, just over 3 weeks after the first ballot casting. 11 names of representative citizens were ponied up, and the sixth with the largest amounts of votes by their townsmen were the aforementioned John Koppel, storekeeper and sometime attorney Ozias McGovney, harness maker and feed salesman Valentine Scher, railroad worker George Smith, shoemaker John Ulrich, and saloonist John Zahn. The most popular of them was John Koppel, who tallied 72 votes. The freshly elected trustees then did some voting themselves and picked Ozias McGovney as the president of the new board, an honor which earned him the venerated place in Mokena's history as our first mayor. 38-year-old John A. Hatch, the son-in-law of Mayor McGovney, was then appointed as our first village clerk. Nowadays, eyebrows would be raised over such a close familial connection in government, but in this case, there was nothing disreputable about it, it being only a reflection of the smallness of our town. Our first town government was an interesting cross-section of Mokena. Of the 5 new trustees, all but one of them were born in Germany, and of the entire board, all of them were fathers. Clerk Hatch and Trustee Smith were veterans, having marched with the Union Army in the Civil War, with the latter having received 4 serious wounds in combat. The most senior of them was the mayor, who was 55 years old at the time he took his oath of office. While the others were by no means newcomers to Mokena, Ozias McGovney had them all beat, having arrived as a lad on the wild, untamed prairie where Mokena would later stand with his family in the fall of 1831. A member of the first European-American family to take up residence in today's Frankfort Township, McGovney was no stranger to holding office. First came a post as Justice of the Peace upon the formation of the township in 1850, then the position of Township Supervisor, before ultimately giving up both in 1870, and a subsequent nomination as Postmaster of Mokena in 1875.
All right, so real quick, I wanted to go back. So for one, in 1878, we have a second attempt at incorporation.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's right.
We don't really know what happens there. They don't ever turn in the petition, or?
Yeah, it's kind of a mystery to me. The only reason I even know about that 1878 attempt, if we want to call it that even, was because I found the original petition in some files at the village hall quite some time ago, many years ago. And yeah, it's a pretty official looking document with a legal description of the village, the incorporated limits that they wanted, and the signatures, all the different signatures of all the guys in town. Of course, since women couldn't vote at the time, it was all men who signed it. And yeah, whatever came of it, though, I don't know whether they sent in their paperwork to the county, whether there was another referendum held. Yeah, it's totally been lost in time.
And there was no opposing referendum to that one that you know of?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. There's no mention in any news media from that time of any of this. So don't really know what was going on other than the fact that that document exists that mentions it. So a petition was at least circulated, but how far it went is kind of a mystery.
So then it was about 2 years later when they get the third attempt.
Yep.
And a fairly decisive victory. When you look at the first one that failed was 25 yes and 64 no's. Now, a couple years later, it goes to 50 yes and 22 no's.
Right, yeah, the tables had turned.
Yeah, that's interesting. People's just minds changing? Or
yeah, I don't know.
They got the right people to vote that year?
Yeah, they must have. I kind of wonder if maybe maybe the saloon keepers might have been promising things to certain people. This is just a theory. I don't mean to besmirch anybody or anything, but maybe they might have been telling guys, yeah, come down here and we'll get you something to drink and then you can go vote, something like this. Just a theory. Who knows? But something happened where people's minds were changed big time in those few years there.
And then you list the 6 that were first elected when we have the election. And so we have John Capel.
His family always pronounced it Capel.
Capel,
yeah.
And then Ozias McGovney.
Oh, yeah.
Valentine Shear, George Smith, good name.
Yeah.
John Holrich, and John Zahn.
Yeah.
So are any of those families still around Mokena?
Oh, let's see. There I know of a descendant of John Capel's who lives in New Lenox. And especially of his family, of the Capel family, there's got to be some still around. I'm sure if I took some time to think about it and go through mentally my list of Mokenians, we'd find some, because Mr. Capel had quite a big family. He had, somebody will call me out on this if I'm wrong, but he had something like 10 kids something like that, that survived into adulthood, not counting the ones that he lost to the black diphtheria plague in the 1870s.
And Capel seems like a name of all of them that is more familiar in the area. Like, I feel like I've seen that that family name as well, other than Smith, which
So there was quite a big family of Capels, and they had a million descendants, and it's very possible that one of Mr. Capel's kin will listen to this. But yes, I know definitely of one in New Lenox. I'm sure there are more, though. Of the other guys, the last one of Ozias McGovney's was Carol Norton, who just recently passed.
Sure.
I can't think of any of the others. Their families are out there somewhere, but I don't know of any that are still in this area. So our most likely candidate would be the Capel family members.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as you said, Ozias McGovney is appointed our first board president and becomes the first mayor of Mokena. I think the picture you have is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a great
He's got
photo.
a great Amish beard going on
he
there.
does.
I love it.
He does. Yeah.
A very stern face.
Yeah. He was a very from what you can tell by looking at pictures of him, he looked like a very stern, sort of no nonsense kind of guy. But luckily we are blessed to have photos of him. And that one I used in the piece on my blog is the oldest known image of him. That came out of an 1878 history of Will County.
Oh wow!
But yeah, he generally had a pretty epic beard, at least in his middle age. By the time he got up into his 70s and his 80s, he was clean shaven. But in his younger years, yeah, he had a pretty good beard going. Yeah.
I'm assuming it's because of his previous elected experience in that, but why they chose Ozias McGovney as first mayor?
Yeah, I think just because he was a pretty prominent guy in town, he and his family, as you mentioned, yeah, he definitely had experience in holding office. He had been supervisor of Frankfort Township. He was the Mokena postmaster. The Mokena post office was in the hands of the McGovney family for just decades and decades. And maybe most importantly, this is just my kind of guess on this, but was his office as Justice of the Peace, which he took when Frankfort Township was first founded in 1850. He was the guy who people would come to marry them. He was settling legal disputes, sort of, or when somebody would get in trouble, he would affix them with a fine or something like that. He was, he had a little bit of power in Mokena and in the days before Mokena existed.
Sure, and the fact that his family had been around since forever,
since day one,
didn't hurt him at all. So
he was just a prominent guy. He was also a prominent businessman. He He had been an attorney, but by the time the incorporation came around, it doesn't look like he was really practicing too much anymore. But he and his son, Ozias Jr., who everyone just called Irwin by his middle name, they had a pretty well-known general store in town. So yeah, he just was a prominent man around Mokena, and just about everybody knew and respected. I would imagine, at least from this point, all these years later, it looks like he was a very respected guy. So
and lived right here, right at Front and Midland.
That is correct. Front and Midland, right on the, let's see, that would be the northeast corner of Front and Midland. That's the old McGovney homestead right there.
And rumored to be one of the oldest buildings, right? One of the original property.
Yeah, easily one of the absolute oldest buildings in Mokena, if not all of eastern Will County.
Wow.
Rumor has it that part of the house that's there now had been a log cabin. So, I mean, the house has been there for a very long time. As the newly incorporated village had no town hall to speak of, the board held their first meetings at Trustee Scher's harness and feed shop on Front Street and got to work drafting the first village ordinances. Looking back upon these handwritten documents, they're a unique window to the 19th century, as they represent pressing problems in town that the founding fathers wanted to fix. They were put to vote by the board and officially adopted on August 4th, 1880. One of the freshly adopted ordinances decreed that fowl were not to run loose, it stating, "It shall be unlawful for any geese, turkeys, ducks, and chickens, or any domestic fowl, to run at large within the limits of the village of Mokena, specifically between the 1st of April until the 1st of October. Any violators could count on a fine of not less than $3 and no more than $25. In what was likely a reference to the aforementioned wild Sundays of the time, another ordinance said that it shall not be lawful for any person or persons within the village of Mokena to disturb the peace of any street, lane, avenue, alley, neighborhood, family, or persons by loud or unusual noises, or by blowing trumpets, horns, or other instruments, or by beating of drums, tambourines, kettles, pans, or other serenading vessels, or implements, or by loud or boisterous language. Bearing silent witness to the ever-present threat of fires, one ordinance mandated that no lighted candle or lamp shall be used in any stable, barn, or building where hay, straw, or other combustible material shall be kept unless the same shall be well secured in a lantern. As so-called hobos often breezed into town over the railroad and tended to cause trouble, another ordinance split hairs defining what exactly constituted a vagrant, it being written that it was a person with no visible means of support, someone who lives idle, or shall be found loitering or strolling about, frequenting places where liquor of any kind is sold, drank, or kept, and could be found in houses of ill fame or bad repute, 10-pin alleys, billiard rooms, sheds, stables, barns, hay, or straw racks. Our founding fathers managed Mokena and, by and by, wore in the seats of their chairs. But the story didn't end in 1880. Flash forward 12 years to April 1892. It was then that a letter came to town from Secretary of State I.W. Pearson, which was taken in hand by then village clerk John Lease. In part, it read, "A certificate of the organization of the village of Mokena was filed in this office May 22nd, 1890, which was paid for at that time. This certificate you retain in the files of your office." As clear as day, this note states that Springfield didn't file our incorporation until 10 years after our townfolk voted on the issue and picked a governing board. Decades later, Mayor and village luminary Richard Quinn remarked, "Apparently, however, someone had neglected to inform the Secretary of State of the incorporation of the village until 1890. Thus begins one of the great mysteries of our town's narrative. What happened in those 10 years? Did the initial paperwork get lost in the mail? Did a local courier get distracted on the way to the state capitol? This issue has hung fire for a good many years, with Quinn, the chairman of the committee that hosted Mokena's official centennial observations in 1980, even suggesting to hold another celebration in 1990, which ultimately never panned out. All has been put to rest, however, by a recent communication between this author and the state's index department. Upon consultation of Springfield's records, officials on their side confirmed that their documents confirm our 1880 incorporation date. Thus, another mystery has been solved and consigned to the history books. The hard work of our founding fathers paid off, and after 144 years, Mokena is still here. Ozias McGovney and his colleagues never could have envisioned the long way we've come, and this author, for one, likes to think that they would be proud of our progress. With all of our modern conveniences, comforts, and prosperity that we enjoy in our village, let us not forget the way that was paved for us.
That last line, I mean, how true. Like, we don't even realize, I mean, that's why these pictures, I think, are really interesting. Because you look back and you see, like, that's not the same front street of today. These aren't, that's people, but it's not the same people. Like, you're living in a different time.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I mean, to think of them, the early settlers of the area coming across, it's really incredible to think about. And,
I agree.
What they did for us to leave us this now.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it really makes you thankful and really makes you appreciate them and all the hard work they put in all those years ago in a different world, really, to give us what we now have and enjoy and maybe sometimes take for granted nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and, not to harp on it, but especially when we look at downtown, downtown Mokena, at one point was a center for the whole area. And shop. Everybody, every villager came to downtown to do their grocery shopping and that. And
yeah, exactly.
And then obviously how that's changed now, and society changes. And
absolutely.
As well.
It has. Yeah.
And then I thought it was really interesting that, the state of Illinois, unshockingly seemed to mess up by missing 10 years of incorporation. But kind of typical Illinois right there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an interesting little footnote to the whole story. Yeah.
So what would have happened if we hadn't incorporated?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I just shot out of the cannon. I think Mokena wouldn't quite have prospered in the way it did. Of course, as we know, towards the 1890s and into the early part of the 20th century, Mokena was in kind of an economic slump at the time anyway. But I can't see that things really would have taken off for the town in the way that they ultimately did. And also, because ultimately the whole thing with the saloons was about money in the local economy. So with the village being incorporated and there not really being a cap anymore on saloons in town, which was bringing in a decent amount of money to the village in terms of the dram shop licenses, or liquor licenses as we call them nowadays.
And so once those, because incorporation, that money was all going to the county.
That's right.
So now this meant that the village would get those proceeds.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the county.
Absolutely.
So we talked about the different new laws and things they passed. For one, so it said, it mentions houses of ill fame or bad repute. Was this an issue in Mokena?
That's interesting.
I mean, I'm thinking of brothels and, obviously.
Yeah, right. No, and that's what that is. That's what they're referring to there. It's very interesting that you bring that up because and I wish so much that I knew more about this. But right around the time of incorporation, there was a so-called house of ill repute that was broken up in Mokena. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we know who was running it, and she did get in trouble for it. I can't quite remember what exactly her punishment was. I don't think she was sent to jail or anything about this. If I remember, I'll have to dig at home. I think she was just fined. But there's a story behind it. How it got found out, who pressed the issue, stopping it. But the fact that was in the ordinances, makes me think that, they didn't just put that in there for nothing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then, so again, all these, new laws and the no pots and pans being banged on the street. Yeah. Did law enforcement change with incorporation?
Yeah, a little bit. Upon incorporation, there was a man who was hired to be the official town marshal, they called him. He's like a constable, like a police officer. And of course, as we know, we've talked about, in the case of Walter Fisher in the past, when we've talked about him, an official Mokena Police Department was still 80 years into the future. But there was a man whose job it was to enforce the law in town, and they built him a calaboose in about 1881 or 1882. That's for those who are unfamiliar with that antiquated word, is like a little one-room shack that serves as a jail.
Is that the calaboose, the one that's still in Lockport?
That's the calaboose. Yep, and that's still the original one. You can go visit it in Lockport at the Heritage Village. A whole other interesting story behind that. But there were constables in Mokena before then, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, now I can't remember if they were appointed by the township or the county. So there were guys, before them, but I think, with having ordinances to enforce and stuff like that, this man whose name was Wesley Kennedy, he probably had a little more power, I think. Yeah.
And are these documents, the original incorporation documents, available? Like, does the village still have them, or have you seen them? Or?
Yeah, they should still have them. As far as I know, the village still and it's been many years since I've actually seen them, but the village should still have all of the original incorporation, let's just call it stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm very lucky in that, excuse me again. I'm very lucky in that quite some time, years ago, I was still in high school, Mr. Quinn, Dick Quinn, who I mentioned in this piece, who was our former mayor and head of the Centennial Committee back in 1980, when he was running the original Mokena Historical Society, they took on a project of transcribing all that stuff.
Wow.
So at one point, he let me go through the copies they had made, and then I went off and made my own copies. So I've got all the stuff at home, and I refer to them from time to time.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff.
Well, great. As we said, it was an extremely important moment for Mokena.
Yeah.
Allowed us to have more bars.
Yeah, definitely.
As well as all the other benefits. But
yeah,
great story.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Matt and I both really hope that you're enjoying the podcast and that you enjoyed this episode. We would really appreciate it if you would share our podcast with your friends or family, as well as leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you hear our podcast. We'd love to hear your show ideas or your questions, so you can send us an email at podcast@mokenasfrontporch.com or on Facebook through Messenger or through our website, which is mokenasfrontporch.com. You can send us a message there. We have a link in the show notes to Matt's blog post that this episode was based on,